A man crawled to her door with no coat, no name, and a wound that should have killed him. She pulled him inside, bandaged him with strips of her own petticoat, and fed him bread her children needed. 5 days later she saw it. A gold watch, heavy, engraved, worth more than everything she owned. Who was this man? And why was he crawling through a blizzard, pretending to have nothing? This channel lives at the crossroads of the Old West and the human heart, cowboy grit, mother's love, and the kind of trust that takes everything you've got to give. The lesson: sometimes the person testing your kindness needs it more desperately than you'll ever know. Subscribe and stay with us. And if this story already has you, like it, share it, and tell me in the comments, would you have let him in?
The man fell face down in the snow and did not move. From inside, her daughter Ellie let out a deep, wet cough. Clara lowered the gun and stepped into the bitter cold. She reached him, sinking to her knees with every step. He was face down, wearing no coat, his shirt frozen stiff with blood. She nudged his boot with her foot. Nothing. "Mister," she said, kicking a little harder. He barely stirred. She knelt and rolled him over. His face was gray, his lips blue, with a white scar cutting through one eyebrow. His eyes opened, but they were empty. "Get up," Clara ordered. "I am not carrying you. If you die on my land, I will have to bury you, and I do not have the strength to dig in this frozen ground." A flicker of life returned to his eyes. He pushed himself up to his knees, swaying. Clara put her shoulder under his arm, the man's weight nearly taking her to the ground. He was a big fella, heavy as a fallen horse. She fought for every step back to the porch. Just as her boot slipped on the ice, the door swung open. It was her 12-year-old Hannah, her face set like stone. "Mama, no. He could be one of Hardgrove's men." "Hannah Grace, you get his other arm, now." With a clenched jaw, Hannah obeyed. Together, they hauled him inside, his body hitting the floorboards with a thud. Clara slammed the door and threw the bolt. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to lean the shotgun against the wall. 8-year-old Sam stood near the bed, gripping his father's hammer with both hands, his eyes locked on the stranger. "Put that down, Sam." "No, ma'am." Clara saw the way he planted his feet, just like his daddy used to when a coyote got near the chickens. A lump formed in her throat. "Fine," she said. "You keep it, but you stay by your sister." From the bed, 5-year-old Ellie coughed again, a deep rattle that seemed to come from her very soul. The stranger lay on the floor, his breathing shallow. A dark stain of blood was slowly spreading across the wood. "He is bleeding something awful," Hannah stated, her voice flat. Clara knelt beside him and lifted his shirt. It was a long, ragged gash, torn by something jagged. The skin around it was hot to the touch. "Hannah, fetch the cloth strips and the pot of water." "We are wasting water on him, Mama." "That water is for Ellie's tea. I will melt more snow. Now go." As Hannah left, Clara pressed her hand against the wound. The man's body jerked, and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes flew open. Clara did not even flinch. She just looked him square in the eye. "Let go of my arm." His gaze was wild, like a spooked horse. "Mister, you are in my house, and my children are watching. You let go of me right now." His eyes finally focused on hers, and the wildness faded. His fingers loosened their grip. "Sorry," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Sorry, ma'am." "Do not call me ma'am. I am not old enough to be a ma'am." "What should I call you?" "Clara." "Clara," he repeated, then closed his eyes. "I am Eli." "Eli what?" When he did not answer, she pushed. "You got a last name, or did you lose it out in the storm?" "Just Eli." A man hiding his name was hiding other things, too. Clara understood hiding. The $85 debt notice from the banker was tucked away in her drawer. Hannah returned with the supplies. Clara cleaned and bandaged the wound with strips from her own petticoat. Eli never made a sound. He just stared at the ceiling, his knuckles white from gripping the floorboards. "You will live," Clara told him. "It is an ugly wound, but it is not deep enough to kill you." "Much obliged." "Do not thank me yet," she said. "This storm could last another 3 days. I have 2 logs left for the fire, a little bit of flour, and 3 children to feed. You are just one more mouth I cannot provide for." He turned his head to look at her. "I will not eat your food. You will, or you will die on my floor. And I already told you I am not digging any graves." A faint smile touched his lips. From the bed, Ellie coughed again, a long, rattling spell that shook her small frame. Sam gently placed a hand on her back. "Your girl," Eli said, his eyes on the bed. "How long has she been sick?" 3 weeks. It gets worse every day. Have you tried willow bark? We used the last of it a week ago." He fell silent, his gaze fixed on the children. "There's a willow grove down by the creek, south of here," he said softly. "About a quarter mile." Clara did not ask how he could possibly know that. She went to a shelf and took down a tin. Inside was a single piece of hard 3-day-old bread. She broke it into 4 pieces. 3 larger ones went to her children. Sam immediately gave a piece of his to Ellie. The smallest piece remained in Clara's hand. Eli watched her from the floor, his eyes following the bread. "Do not," he whispered. "That is yours." "I know what it is," she said. She placed the small piece on the shelf just above his head, where he could reach it. Then she turned her back and went to the stove. She did not need to see if he took it. A long moment passed. Then she heard the quiet sound of hard bread being carefully chewed. She did not turn around. The fire popped, a weak wave of heat pushing back the cold. Night came on fast, and the wind returned with a vengeance, making the cabin walls groan. Clara checked the bolt on the door twice. The children were asleep, or at least pretending to be. Clara sat by the stove, her back to the wall, watching over the room. She could tell Eli was awake by the sound of his breathing. "You ought to get some sleep," she said into the darkness. "I cannot." "Is it the pain?" "No, I am thinking." "About what?" "About a woman who points a shotgun at a man one minute, then drags him inside the next." "Do not make it out to be more than it was. I would have done the same for a stray dog." "No, you would not have," he said. The firelight caught the side of his face, highlighting the scar and the hard line of his jaw. His eyes were open, watching her. "You do not know me," she said. "I know you split that bread 4 ways," he replied quietly, "and kept none for yourself." The fire hissed. Ellie coughed softly in her sleep. "That little girl needs a doctor," Eli said. "Town is a good 12 miles off," Clara answered, her jaw set hard. "The roads are buried deep, and I have no horse. She had to sell it back in October when Harrove hiked the taxes on her land. $42 due by January, and the horse only brought in 20. "I have $18 saved," she admitted, the words spilling out into the dark. $18 against a world of debt, including a banknote for 85 her husband left behind. The stranger, Eli, was quiet for a moment. "This Harrow fellow," he said. "He is the one buying up all the land, is he not?" Clara stared. How could he know? "I passed 2 empty places coming here. Good land, but the gardens looked like folks left in a hurry. Nobody just walks away from a good homestead unless they are pushed." A man near death, yet he saw everything. "Who are you?" she asked. "I told you," he said, his eyes closed. "Eli, that is not what I mean. I know what you mean. And I am not ready to answer," he finished. "You are on my floor," she said, her voice low, "using my linens for bandages and eating bread meant for my children." "I know. Then you owe me an answer." "I do," he said, opening his eyes. But not tonight. They both lay awake in the dark, their burdens too heavy for sleep. Clara's mind went to the tax notice in the drawer, to that $42 she did not have. She pictured Harov's smile in church, the smile of a man looking at property he already owned. She thought of finding Jim, her husband, frozen at the bottom of a mine shaft, his hands still reaching for home. She had dug his grave herself. And now she had given her last bit of food and kindness to this stranger on her floor, spending what little she had on someone who might not be worth it. The fire died down and the cold crept in. Just before dawn, a small sound woke her. Eli was sitting up, his back to her. In the faint glow of the dying coals, she saw something metal gleam in his hands. He turned it over gently before tucking it back inside his shirt. In that brief moment, Clara saw it plain as day. A heavy engraved gold watch. A watch worth more than her entire farm. Her breath caught in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding against her ribs. No drifter carried a watch like that. Lying in the dark, she pretended to be asleep, but one question burned in her mind. Who was this man? And what was he doing half dead in a blizzard with a fortune hidden under his shirt? That watch proved he was not lost or poor. He was a liar. When the gray morning light finally came, he was already awake, watching her. Clara peeked through her lashes as he stood up, moving stiffly. He walked past the bread tin without opening it, his eyes landing on the 2 logs left by the cold stove. She saw the understanding on his face. He knew what only 2 logs meant in a blizzard. Instead of starting a fire, he quietly unbolted the door and slipped outside, pulling it shut so the last bit of warmth would not escape. "Where is he off to?" Hannah whispered from her bed. "Good riddance, I hope." Clara did not reply, just went to the frosted window. She saw him limping toward the trees, one arm clutched against his side, heading into the still falling snow. He was gathering firewood. Slowly but with purpose, he snapped dry branches from the pines, stacking them neatly on the porch. He made several trips, and by the time he came back inside, his lips were blue with cold. But he had enough wood for 2 days. He built a proper fire, and warmth finally pushed back the chill. Clara was holding Ellie, whose fever had worsened through the night. The little girl's eyes were glassy, and her breathing was shallow. Eli saw the child and stopped his work. "How bad is she?" he asked. "Worse. The fever is way up." He stood. "The storm is letting up some. I figure I have 4 hours before it turns back. I need to get to the creek for willow bark." Clara was stunned. "How can you possibly know that?" "I have been reading weather for 20 years, was all he said. He pulled on his boots. "I will be back in 2 hours. If I am not, you stay put. Just keep the fire hot and the girl warm. You will tear that wound wide open," she warned. "Probably, and bleed to death." "Probably not," he said, then left without another word. "He is crazy, Mama," Hannah said. "Nobody goes out in a blizzard for some tree bark." "He is," Clara agreed, holding Ellie tight. "I do not know why." Her son, Sam, appeared at her side, holding his father's hammer. "Should I go with him?" he asked. "Daddy would have." The words hit Clara hard. "No, sweet boy. Your daddy would want you right here, protecting your sisters." Sam nodded gravely and took up his post by Ellie's bed, the hammer resting on his lap. An hour passed. Ellie's cough grew deeper, a hollow sound that scared Clara. She tried to feed the child some thin gruel, but it would not stay down. Across the room, Hannah was mending a sock, her needle moving with a fierce energy. "Mama," she said suddenly, "that man is not what he pretends to be. He has not pretended to be much of anything," Clara replied. "That is just it," Hannah said, biting a thread. "A real drifter makes himself small. He talks and talks so you will not throw him out. This one, he just makes himself useful." "How is that different?" Clara asked. Hannah looked her mother square in the eye. "A man who makes himself useful is a man who is aiming to stay." The words hung in the air. "You are only 12. How do you know such things?" Hannah's gaze did not waver. "Because that is what Daddy did when he first came around. He just showed up, fixed the porch, and waited." Clara couldn't find her words. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. That just ain't the same thing. The door blew open, letting in a swirl of snow and bitter cold. In walked Eli, his arms loaded down with strips of pale white bark that curled like old paper. A dark red stain was spreading across the left side of his shirt, where the bandage had given up. He looked pale as a ghost, but his eyes were clear and full of purpose. He marched right over to the stove, dropped the bark on the table, and started breaking it up with hands that shook from the cold. He just said, "Pot. Boiling water." Clara jumped to it. He tossed the bark into the water, and a bitter steam filled the cabin. It was the smell of medicine, the smell of trying your best when you had nothing left. "Let it sit for 10 minutes, he told her. "Any longer, and it's too bitter for the girl to keep down." "How do you know all this?" "I lost 40 head of cattle one winter to a fever." He slid down to the floor like his legs just quit on him, pressing a hand to his side where blood was starting to seep through his fingers. "I learned to make do with what the land gives you. Willow bark, sage. I'm no doctor. I'm just a man who couldn't stand to lose anything else. 40 head of cattle." The words stuck with Clara. No drifter ever owned 40 head of cattle. She knelt down beside him. "Let me get a look at that wound." "It's fine. It's bleeding clean through your shirt." "Let me see." He finally moved his hand. She lifted his shirt, peeling back a bandage soaked in bright red. The gash had pulled wide open from his walk. Fresh blood was welling up, slow and stubborn. "You tore it wide open." "Figured I might. And you went out there anyway." His gaze went past her, landing on little Ellie, who was shaking with each cough. "Yeah, I went anyway." Clara cleaned the wound again, wrapping it twice as tight this time. He sucked air through his teeth when she pulled the knot, but she didn't say sorry. "You keep this up, and it'll get infected. Then I'll have 2 people dying on my floor instead of just 1. Nobody is dying. You don't get to make that call." He looked her square in the eye. "Neither do you, but we sure can put up a fight." The willow tea was ready. Clara poured a cup and carried it to Ellie. She lifted the little girl's head and held the cup to her lips. "Drink this, baby. I know it tastes bad, but drink." Ellie took a small sip, then coughed. Clara laid a hand on her forehead and just waited. She prayed without any words, the way she had since her Jim died. Words hadn't done a lick of good then. Sam sat by his sister, his little hand on her arm. "Is the medicine gonna work?" he asked. Clara looked over at Eli, who was leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. He opened one. "It will work," he said, looking straight at Sam. "Man to man, the fever will break by tonight. Her cough will linger, but she'll be on the mend. You promise?" Eli paused for just a second. Clara saw the weight of that word, a promise made to a boy whose own daddy had broken the biggest promise of all. "I promise," Eli said. Sam gave a single nod, picked up his hammer, and went back to standing guard over his sister. Clara saw something raw and painful in Eli's face as he watched the boy, something he tried to hide the second he knew she was looking. "Don't," Clara said softly. "Don't what?" "Don't look at my son that way." "What way is that?" "Like you're looking at a ghost." Eli's jaw tightened and he looked away. "I had a younger brother, same age as your boy when I lost him." Clara didn't push for more. Some stories only come out when they're good and ready. The afternoon dragged on. Ellie slept, her breathing getting a little easier. The fever wasn't climbing, at least. The willow tea was doing its job, slow but sure. Eli sat near the stove, carving a piece of firewood with a small knife. The blade was worn, the bone handle smooth from years of use. Hannah just watched him from the table. She hadn't taken her eyes off him since he'd come back. "You know about cattle," Hannah said. It wasn't a question. Eli's knife stopped moving. "A little. You said you lost 40 head. That's more than a little. That's a whole herd." "It was a long time ago." "How long, Hannah?" "Mama, I'm just asking a question. You always said that's how a person learns." A small smile touched Eli's lips. Your mother's right. He started carving again. 12 years ago, it was a bad winter, north of here in Montana. You ran cattle in Montana. I did. How many head? Hannah. Clara's voice was sharp. Eli put his carving down and looked right at the girl. You are a smart one, he said. You want to know if I'm a dangerous man. Hannah stared back, not even blinking. Are you? Not to y'all. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not. The honesty of it filled the room. I have done things I am not proud of, Eli said. I have fought men, and I have made choices that cost people dearly. I trusted the wrong folks, and I am still paying that price. He picked up his carving, his dage. But I have never raised a hand to a woman or a child, and I'm not about to start in the home of a woman who saved my life. You can have 2 biscuits, Hannah announced, her back to him as she worked the last of their flour into a dough. Ellie and Sam get 3 apiece. So does Mama. Eli watched her. And you? She did not answer. You gave your brother your bread last night, he said quietly. Clara spun around. You did what, Hannah? The girl's face burned with shame. He is a growing boy. Clara's voice was stern. We do not skip meals in this house. What house? Hannah's voice finally broke. Harrov takes it in 6 weeks. We have a sick child, no money, and a wounded stranger on our floor. Her hands trembled in the dough. I am 12 years old. I know how many days that flour will last. I have to keep counting, Mama, or I will start to scream. A heavy silence fell in the small cabin. Clara walked over and gently took her daughter's hands from the bowl. I know you are scared, Clara whispered, holding her daughter's flour-dusted hands. I am scared, too. A single tear escaped Hannah's eye before she pulled away and went back to the dough. He still only gets 2 biscuits, she insisted. Clara almost smiled. Later, as the blizzard finally quieted, Ellie's fever broke just as suddenly. One moment she was burning up, the next her forehead was cool. She looked right at her mother and whispered, Mama, I'm hungry. Relief washed over Clara. Across the room, Eli quietly placed a small wooden horse he had carved near the stove. He was a man who clearly knew horses. An hour passed before Sam found it. He turned the little horse over in his hands and looked at the stranger. Is this for me? Eli just nodded. You can have it. Sam stared at the carving in the firelight. A gentleness came over Sam's face, something Clara had not seen since his father passed. My daddy used to carve, he said softly. Eli just nodded. Sam tucked the horse into his pocket next to his hammer and went to bed, one hand on each. Once her children were all asleep, Clara sat across the fire from Eli. Let me see the watch, she said. He froze, his knife still. What watch are you talking about? The gold one. I saw you with it last night. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Finally, he reached into his shirt and placed it between them on the floor. The firelight made the gold gleam. It was a heavy, handsome thing. Open it, he told her. She did. The lid sprang open, revealing a white porcelain face. The hands were still ticking. Inside the cover, an engraving read, ETB, build something worth keeping. Eli T. something, she said, looking at him. The B is for Blackwell, he replied, his face a mask of shadow and firelight. He took the watch from her. My father gave this to me when I turned 22. Told me to build something worth keeping. He paused. It took me 16 years. I turned 50 head of cattle into 4,000. But then a man I trusted took it all with lies and a crooked judge. I won it all back in the courts, every last acre, but I lost everything else. All my so-called friends only cared about my money. He explained how his horse had broken its leg 20 miles out, forcing him to walk until he collapsed in the snow. He looked right at her. Then a woman with a shotgun pulled me from a snowdrift and fed me her last piece of bread. A pang of pain hit Clara's chest. I need the whole truth, Eli. Your full name, your money, why you are here. I have 3 kids and 6 weeks until this place is gone. I do not have time for games." Eli looked at the woman who had saved him, now demanding the one thing he could not give. "Not tonight," he said, his hand on the watch. "But soon, I promise." "Your promise means nothing when I do not even know you." "It means everything," he insisted. "You just do not know it yet." Clara rose, her knees aching from the cold floor. She glanced at the fresh blood on his bandage. "Soon," she repeated, her voice firm. Then she went to her children, lying beside them as they slept soundly. Sam held the hammer in one hand and that little carved horse in the other as he slept. In the quiet dark, Clara listened to Eli getting settled on the floorboards. She heard his breathing even out and the old cabin groaning in the cold. Sometime deep in the night, he whispered something so low she almost missed it. "Build something worth keeping." After that, there was only the sound of the fire turning to embers and the snow starting up again, falling soft and steady, burying the whole world. On the 5th morning, the storm finally gave up. Clara swung the door open to a world gone silent and white. There was no wind, just the slow plink of ice melting off the porch roof. The sky was a heavy gray, but the snow had quit. Eli was already out there just like every morning since he arrived. He'd build a fire, chop a hole in the creek for water, and stack firewood by the door before the sun was even thinking about rising. Clara had quit pretending she didn't see it, quit acting like it didn't mean something. He was down at the fence line where the north section had buckled under all that snow. He was digging out the wire with his bare hands, his hurt side still bound up tight under his shirt. He moved a little slow, but Lord, he never stopped. 5 days he'd been here, and her fences stood straighter than they had in years. The woodpile was stacked higher than her head. The chicken coop door, which had hung crooked for a year, now swung true. Even the leak over Ellie's bed was patched tight with pine tar. He never asked, just saw what was busted and put it right. Ellie was doing better, too. Her cough was drier now, and she'd eaten a whole biscuit that morning. Clara walked out to the fence, her boots crunching on the snow. The air was sharp and clean. Eli saw her coming and stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "This fence is in worse shape than I figured," he said. "Whole section needs new posts. They're rotten at the base." "I'm aware," she said, her voice tight. He looked at her. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know what you didn't mean," she shot back. "My husband was sick, then he was gone. That left me with 3 kids, 2 hands, and 1,000 things falling apart." Eli just nodded. He didn't say he was sorry again. He just picked up the wire and got back to his work. Clara watched him for a long moment. "The road to town ought to be clear by tomorrow," she said. His hands froze. "I've got to get supplies. The flour and salt are gone. The children need food." "I'll go with you." "No," she said flatly. "You showing up in town with me will get folks talking. That busybody Harrove will hear about the widow Mallister taking in strays before I've even paid for my goods." Eli dropped the wire and faced her. "He's going to find out one way or another. You think your neighbors haven't seen the smoke from your chimney all week? They'll wonder how you suddenly have firewood when you were down to your last stick 5 days ago." The thought hit her like a slap. "I'll go by myself," she insisted. "Take Sam with me. I'll tell people I did some mending work in exchange for the wood. If I see Harrove, I'll walk right past him just like always, with my $18 and 5 weeks left to pay." The number was a weight between them, 35 days. "Let me help you," Eli said, his voice low. "You are helping. You're fixing my fence." "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it." "Oh, I know exactly what you mean," Clara said, stepping closer. "You want to pay my debt. Stroll into town with your fancy gold watch and your secret money and just make it disappear. You think that would be a good thing? Wouldn't it be?" "No," she said, her voice like iron. "Because that makes me indebted to you. It makes me the widow who couldn't handle her own business. I'd owe a man who won't even give me his name." Eli's jaw went tight. "Beckett," he said, finally looking at her. "Elijah Thornton Beckett." The name hung in the cold air, but it meant nothing to her. My father was Colonel William Beckett, he went on. He ran the biggest cattle operation in Montana, 4,000 head of cattle and a ranch house bigger than this whole town. He explained that his father died and left him everything. He grew the ranch, made it even bigger, but he made a mistake. He took on a partner, a man named Marcus Crane, to handle the books while he handled the herd. And this Crane fellow double-crossed you. It wasn't a question. He filed papers claiming I was unstable, that I was a danger. He tried to take it all, Eli said. He told every judge and banker from here to Fort Worth that I was a violent man, not to be trusted. Was he lying? Clara asked, looking him square in the eye. About the violent part, Eli admitted, his voice flat. Some rustlers hit the ranch. The second time they caught me alone. I fought back. Hurt a couple of them pretty bad. Crane used that against me, he continued. Said it proved I was dangerous. I won the fight in court, but I lost everything else. My friends, my reputation, everyone. He dropped the wire he'd been twisting. So I sold the whole spread, signed the papers, and rode south with that watch and a pile of money in a Denver bank. Clara felt her breath catch. How much money? Enough. How much? She pressed. $12,000. The number was so big it didn't even sound real. Her whole debt was $127. He had enough money to buy the whole county and never miss it. You crawled to my cabin in a blizzard, she said slowly. Half dead, with no horse, looking like you didn't have a dime to your name. My horse broke her leg about 20 miles out, he said. I had to put her down and just started walking. I was looking for something. For what? For proof, he said, his eyes locking with hers. Proof that somebody in this world would help a stranger with nothing just because it was the right thing to do. Clara stood there, frozen. Something hot and sharp rose in her chest, a mix of pure fury and a terrible kind of understanding. You were testing me. Yes, he said. This entire time. The firewood, the fence, fixing the roof. You were seeing if the poor woman would help the poor man. And that watch, she said, her voice trembling. You made sure I saw it that first night. You knew I was awake. He didn't have to answer. His silence was enough. Without thinking, she swung her open hand and cracked it across his face. The sound echoed in the stillness. He took the blow, his head snapping to the side. Then he turned back to face her, a red mark blooming on his cheek. I deserved that, he said quietly. You deserve a hell of a lot worse, she spat. My daughter went hungry so we could stretch the flour. My son sleeps with a hammer because he's scared of who might come through our door. My baby nearly died from a fever just a few feet from where you were hiding a gold watch worth more than my whole life. I know, he whispered. You know. She let out a sharp, broken laugh. And that makes it all right? No, nothing makes it all right, but I couldn't just offer you money. A woman with your kind of pride, you would have sent me packing right back into that storm. Money. Let me settle your debts. Let me get medicine for your little girl. His voice finally cracked, the first time she had ever heard it waver. It seemed every smile and every handshake had been about what Elijah Beckett's money could do for them. When that money vanished, so did they. He took a shaky breath. I just needed to know if one person on this earth could be decent. And you were my test. My last hope. His words stopped her cold. Her hand still tingled from the slap she had given him. She looked at this man who had lost an empire and then crawled through a blizzard, all to see if a widow with only $18 would share her last piece of bread. You are a fool, she said plainly. Yes, ma'am. Do not call me ma'am. You are a rich, selfish fool, Eli Beckett, who let my child go hungry just to prove a point to yourself. I am, he admitted. And if you believe for 1 second I will let you pay my debts out of guilt, it is not guilt. It is a partnership. She practically spat the word. An equal partnership, 50-50, your land, your knowledge, your sweat equity, my money and my experience with cattle. We can build something real. I do not need a partner. You need $127 in 5 weeks. I will figure it out. How? By selling your mama's wedding ring? Clara's entire body went rigid. She had not told him about that ring. Not one single word. Her eyes searched his face for an answer. "In the drawer by your bed," he said quietly, "wrapped in a handkerchief with lace trim. I noticed it the second morning while I was building the fire. You searched through my things. The drawer was already open. I saw it, but I did not touch it. That ring is the only thing I have left of my mother. I know. You do not know a single thing about her. I know she made lace with her own hands. I know the ring is simple gold and worn thin. I know you wrapped it in the most precious thing she left you, which means it was her whole world, and now it is yours." Clara's eyes began to burn, but she refused to cry. Not for him. She had used up all her tears when she buried her husband, Jim. She had none left for a wealthy man playing games on her property. "I am going into town tomorrow," she stated, "by myself. When I return, you will be gone." She turned and headed for the cabin. "Clara." She did not stop. "I will be gone if that is what you want, but before I leave, please let me leave enough to cover your debt. You do not have to call it a partnership. Just let me do this one decent thing." She stopped on the porch, her hand on the wooden rail, the same rail Eli had repaired just 3 days before. "That is not how this works," she said without looking back. "You do not get to lie to me for 5 days and then try to buy your way out of it. Then you tell me how it works." She went inside and shut the door. Hannah was standing right there by the table. She had heard it all. Clara saw the truth in her daughter's eyes. "He is rich," Hannah whispered. "Yes. This entire time. Yes. And he watched us nearly starve. He brought Ellie tree bark tea after he let us go hungry." Hannah's voice was like ice. "He could have helped us from the very beginning, but he just watched us, like we were some kind of test." Clara had no answer because her daughter was right. "I want him gone," Hannah said. "He will be gone tomorrow. I want him gone right now. Now, Mama. Before Ellie gets too attached. Before Sam." She trailed off. Her gaze fell to the little carved horse in Sam's pocket. It had been there for 3 days. Sam's hand went to it whenever he felt scared or lonely. "Oh," Hannah said softly, a terrible understanding dawning on her. "Sam does not know, does he?" Clara replied. "Sam knows. He just does not care because someone finally made him a horse, and that is the first gift anyone has given him since his daddy passed away." Clara sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. "Mama." Hannah's small, strong hand landed on her shoulder. "What are we going to do?" "I do not know, honey." "But you always know." "Not this time." They sat there in the silence. The fire crackled in the hearth. In the corner, Sam held the little wooden horse up to the window, making it gallop along the sill. Suddenly, Clara's head snapped up. Hoofbeats. Hannah rushed to the window. "Mama, there are riders." Clara looked out. 2 men on horseback were coming up the road from the south, moving slow but steady through the snow. One of them rode a big bay horse she knew well, Hargrove's horse. "Get away from the window," Clara ordered. "Take the children to the back corner and be quiet." "Mama, what?" "Now, Hannah." Hannah quickly gathered her siblings and hurried them behind the stove. Clara grabbed the shotgun. She had been saving the last 2 shells for a rabbit. The cabin door opened and Eli stepped inside. "2 riders," he said, his face grim. "Coming from the south. I see them. One is on Hargrove's horse." Eli's eyes darted to the shotgun in her hands. "Let me handle this," he said. "This is my land," Clara replied. "My home. My fight." He looked at her for a long moment, then stepped to the side. He stood beside her, not behind her, so close their shoulders nearly touched. He grabbed the hammer he had left by the door. "Your fight," he said, "but I am standing with you." The riders reached their gate. The bigger man dismounted. It was not Hargrove, but his foreman, Burl Kendrick, a mean-looking man wrapped in a heavy coat. He walked up the path like he owned it. Clara stepped onto the porch, holding the shotgun. Kendrick stopped about 10 feet away. His eyes flickered between Clara and Eli. He had not expected to see another man there. "Mrs. Mallister." Mr. Kendrick, Judge Hargrove sends his best. Just wanted to see if you made it through the storm all right. We made it just fine. That is good to hear. His gaze lingered on Eli. You have got company, I see. That is not your concern. No, ma'am, I suppose it is not. He reached inside his coat. Clara gripped the shotgun tighter. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. The judge asked me to deliver this to you personally. He held it out. Clara did not move. Leave it on the gate post, she said. Kendrick gave a yellow-toothed smile. Now, Mrs. Mallister, no need to be unfriendly. Set it on the post and then leave. His smile vanished, though his eyes turned hard. He gave Eli one last sizing-up look, then walked back to the gate. He placed the paper on the post, got on his horse, and the two men rode off. Clara waited until they were gone before she walked to the gate and picked up the paper. She had to read it twice. The words just would not make sense the first time. Eli came down from the porch. What is it? Clara folded the paper and went back inside. She sat at the table and stared at it. He moved the date up. Her voice was flat and empty. The tax sale has been moved from January 15th to December 23rd. That is in 3 weeks, the day before Christmas Eve. Eli stood in the doorway. He cannot do that, Eli said. There is a 30-day notice requirement by law. Clara looked up at him. You seem to know a lot about tax law all of a sudden. I know enough. It does not matter what the law says. In this county, Judge Hargrove is the law. He sets the dates and he runs the auction. He will pick the winning bid. She smoothed the paper out on the table. 3 weeks, not 5. 3? 21 days. Hannah whispered from the corner. Clara closed her eyes. 21 days. She had $18 in a coffee tin to fight a debt of $127 against a judge who changed the rules just to be cruel. Eli sat down across from her. Let me help you. No. Clara, you only have 3 weeks. I said no. Your pride is going to make your children homeless. The words struck her harder than her own slap, because they were true. Get out, she whispered. No. I told you to be gone by tomorrow, and I am telling you that I am not leaving. This is not your fight. You are right, it is not. It is yours. He leaned in closer. But I am making it my fight. Not because you asked me to, but because your little girl survived a fever that should have taken her. Because your son sleeps with a hammer for protection. Because your 12-year-old daughter skips her own meals so her brother can eat. His voice grew thick with emotion. Because you gave me shelter and food I did not deserve. That is the most decent thing anyone has done for me in 2 years, and I will not stand by while a man like Hargrove takes this home from you. Mama, let him help. It was Sam's small voice from the doorway. He stood there with his hammer and his little wooden horse, his eyes looking old and serious. Daddy would have let him help. The cabin fell silent. There was only the sound of the fire and her own ragged breathing. Clara looked at her children, then at the man across from her with his scarred hands and his hidden fortune. She saw something in his face she was finally beginning to trust. Partners, she said, the word feeling rough in her throat. Not charity. Partners. We're either equals or it's nothing. Equal, he agreed. My money for your land and your hard work. It's a fair trade. And you tell me everything, she added. No more secrets, no more tests. You don't get to watch my family starve while you're hiding gold in your pocket. Everything, he promised. And if you cross me, she said, her voice dropping low, if you turn out to be just another man who lies and takes, I swear I will find you. And next time the shotgun won't be for show. Eli reached his hand across the table. It was the hand that had fixed her home and carved a toy for her son. Clara took it. Hannah put her hand over her mother's, her eyes fixed on Eli. You hurt my mama, and you will answer to me. A look of pure respect crossed his face. I believe you, he said. Sam added his small hand to the pile. Partners, he stated firmly. Outside, fresh snow began to cover the tracks left by Harov's men. Eli left before the sun was up. Clara heard the horse fade into the quiet morning and told herself the hollow feeling was hunger. He had paid for the horse with cash from a money belt. He had money that whole time, while her family was on the brink of starvation. She got up, adding wood to the fire he'd stacked and boiling water he'd hauled. She couldn't do a single thing in her own cabin without seeing his help everywhere. "He's coming back, you know," Hannah said from the table. "He said he would." "Men say a lot of things, Hannah. Daddy said he would be back, too." That morning, he left for the mine. The words stopped Clara cold. The fire crackled in the silence. "That's not fair," Clara whispered. "I know," Hannah's voice was suddenly very small. "I know, Mama. I just don't want to see you get hurt again." Clara went to her daughter and put an arm around her thin shoulders. Hannah sat stiff as a board. "If he doesn't come back," Clara said, "we will figure it out just like we always do. And if he does come back, well, we'll figure that out too." 3 days went by. Eli did not return. The first day, Clara tried to fix the fence line herself, her hands bleeding through her gloves. The second day, Agnes Whitmore showed up. She was 60 years old and built like a fence post, carrying a basket with 4 eggs and a jar of broth. "Heard you had a visitor," Agnes said, walking right in. She put her basket down and her eyes took in everything. The extra bedroll, the tools that weren't Jim's, the perfectly stacked firewood. "Had a visitor," Clara admitted. "He's gone now." Agnes picked up Ellie, feeling her forehead and checking her breathing. "This child's been taking willow bark tea. I know you were out because I gave you my last batch a month ago, so either you found a willow in a blizzard or someone found one for you." Clara poured 2 cups of coffee. "His name is Eli. Found him half dead in the storm. He stayed for 5 days, and now he has gone to town." "How do you know he went to town?" Agnes gave a little smile. "Because Burl Kendrick is telling everyone at the saloon that the widow Mallister has a man living with her, and because a stranger just bought a horse and sent 4 telegrams from the post office, paid with silver dollars." Clara's heart sank. "Kendrick works for Harov, of course he told people." Agnes leaned in close. "What I need to know is who this man is and what he wants here." Clara told her everything. The fancy watch, the money, the full name he'd given her. Elijah Thornton Beckett, the story about a cattle empire in Montana, and a betrayal. Agnes listened, her old hands wrapped around the coffee cup. "Beckett," she said after a long quiet. "I heard that name years ago. Colonel Beckett ran the biggest cattle operation in the whole Montana territory. They said his son just walked away from it all, sold every last acre." Agnes looked Clara right in the eye. "And now that man is in your cabin, fixing your fence. I am wondering if any of it matters." "Real or not, Harov moved the date. I have $18 and a piece of paper that says I lose this place right before Christmas." 12 days from now," Agnes corrected her. "Not 3 weeks. 12 days." Agnes stood and buttoned her coat. "I have watched Harov take 6 homesteads in 2 years, all of them gone, bought out for pennies on the dollar." She picked up her basket. "If this Beckett fellow is who he says, and if he's willing to put up a fight, then you let him." Clara stared into her cold coffee, feeling utterly alone. In just 12 days, on December 23rd, Judge Hargrove and his cronies planned to sell her home right on the courthouse steps. This is a story about a woman pushed to the edge, who learns that some fights are too big to face alone. On the 10th day of his absence, Eli finally rode back. Clara was hauling water from the frozen creek when she saw him on the south road. He wasn't alone. Behind him was a stranger in a fine wool coat that probably cost more than her whole cabin. Eli swung down and latched the gate with those same careful hands she remembered. Every part of her ached, but seeing him sparked a mix of pure fury, and a relief so strong it almost buckled her knees. "You were gone 10 days, she said, her voice flat. "I know. You said a few days. Things got complicated." "What things?" Eli nodded toward the other man. "Clara, this is Mr. Aldous Fletcher, a lawyer from Denver." The man tipped his hat. Mrs. Mallister, your partner told me about your troubles. Partner? She shot back at Eli. Is that what you are now? We had a deal, Eli said, standing his ground. We had a deal before you vanished for 10 days, leaving me with 3 kids in 12 days till I lose everything. Eli took the heat without flinching, because he knew she had earned the right to be angry. The lawyer, Mr. Fletcher, cleared his throat and suggested they talk inside. He spread legal papers all over her small table, full of words she barely understood. He explained he had filed an emergency appeal with the territorial court to challenge the crooked assessment on her property. What does that mean in plain talk? She demanded. It means Judge Hargrove is in a whole heap of trouble, the lawyer said. He laid it all out. The judge's brother-in-law had tripled her property's value. 5 other families had been cheated the same way, with all their land bought up by the judge's own bank. That ain't news, she said flatly. No, ma'am, Fletcher agreed, but it is news to the governor, who now has my report, and a petition signed by 18 other folks from this county who lost their land the same way. 18? Clara asked, her head snapping up. Mr. Fletcher almost smiled. He said that Agnes Whitmore rode for 2 days, gathering every signature and story. She told him to tell you this fight ain't just yours anymore. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. So what happens now? We go to a court in Denver, the lawyer said, one that Judge Hargrove doesn't own. The emergency appeal stops all tax sales until the case is heard. That means the auction on the 23rd cannot happen. He can't sell my land, she whispered, the words feeling foreign. Not until a judge rules, and that could take months. The relief washed over her so hard the room started to spin. Eli put a hand on her shoulder to steady her, but she shook it off. I'm fine. She walked out onto the porch, gulping the cold air. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Eli followed, giving her space. You should have told me you were bringing a lawyer, she said, not looking at him. You should have told me about Agnes. You would have just said no, Eli replied. You would have called it charity. She spun on him. You think I don't know I need help? I've known it every single morning for 2 years when I do the math, and it never adds up. But I get up anyway, I feed my children anyway, and I fight because it is all I have. Her voice cracked, but she held it steady. Do not you dare tell me I need help like I am too proud to know it. The only difference between us is that I have been living this nightmare while you were riding around feeling sorry for yourself. The accusation hung in the air between them. Eli just stood there and took it. You're right, he said quietly. I was a broken man looking for a sign. Then why did you stop here? She demanded. Because you pointed a shotgun at me and then you carried me inside, he said, his voice soft. Because I saw your children share their last bit of food and I saw you caring for a dying baby when you had nothing left to give. I stopped looking for signs the day you slapped some sense into me. Everything since then has been real. How do I know that? He asked. Because I brought a lawyer from Denver in the dead of winter to fight for a woman who just told me to my face she does not need my help. Clara just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his tired eyes. Have you ever seen a good person get backed into a corner by somebody with more money and more power? You know it is not right, but you feel helpless. Well, this is a story about a woman named Clara who refused to be helpless. It reminds us that sometimes standing your ground is the only move you have left. She told the man, "You slapped me in front of my children." Her daughter Hannah watched, nodding in agreement. A strange little laugh escaped Clara, sharp and unexpected. She tried to hide it, turning away. "This is not funny," she said. He kept calling her ma'am, and she told him to stop. She had to steady her nerves before facing him again. "So you have $12,000 in a bank up in Denver? And you crawled through a blizzard to get here?" She admitted it sounded crazy when he said it like that. "But you said we were partners," she reminded him. "Equal partners. I put up my land, and you put up the money. We build something together 50-50. That was the deal." So if we win against Hargrove, we build." Eli looked out at her property, at the fence he had already fixed and the cabin that needed work. He said they would start small, with about 30 head of cattle, and hire a couple of hands. But Clara asked, with what money? Eli just smiled. 12,000 is more than enough. Clara leaned on the porch, arms crossed, and asked if he planned to stay. Eli said he would if she would have him. He offered to build a small bunkhouse to sleep in until they figured things out. He looked her in the eye and said, "I am only asking to be here, to work, and to build something worth keeping." Those words reminded her of the inscription on the old watch. She told him plainly, "My children always come first, before this ranch, and before you." Eli said he would expect nothing less. Clara warned him that her daughter Hannah did not trust him and would make his life difficult. He just replied, "She already does." Clara's voice softened when she spoke of her son. "Sam lost his father. He is looking for something in you that might not be there." Eli grew quiet for a moment. "I know what he is looking for," he said. "I cannot be his father, but I can be a man who shows up and does what he says he will do." Clara reminded him, "You already left once to get the lawyer." "I came back," he answered. "I will come back every time. That is not a promise I make lightly." The back door opened and Hannah stepped out, her face showing she had heard everything. "Mr. Fletcher needs to go over the papers." Hannah looked hard at Eli, and for a moment the tension in her face eased just a little. She said, "Mama needs to sign 7 papers. Clara told her she would be right in." Before going back inside, Hannah looked at Eli one last time. "There are a couple of biscuits left on the stove if you want them." Eli watched the door close behind her, surprised. "Did she just offer me food?" he asked. Clara just said, "Do not make a big deal out of it." Inside, Mr. Fletcher laid the documents out and explained each one. With Hannah standing right behind her chair, Clara signed her name 7 times. Her handwriting looked shaky and small, and she hated it. Eli watched her without saying a word. When she was done, Fletcher packed everything up. He told them he would file the papers in Denver. The order to freeze Hargrove's actions should be in effect within 2 days. Clara worried that Judge Hargrove would be furious. Fletcher simply smiled and said, "That is exactly what we are counting on. Angry men make mistakes, and mistakes win lawsuits." Clara watched him ride off, a lone figure shrinking against the snow until he was gone. Just a few weeks back, she was all alone in this world. Now she heard her daughter Ellie, voice clearer than it had been in ages, say, "Mama, I'm hungry." A real laugh bubbled up from a place deep inside Clara she thought had dried up. She turned from the window and grabbed the good flour tin, Eli's gift, and began to make biscuits. Her boy Sam was on the floor showing Eli a small wooden horse, talking a mile a minute about saddles and barns. And Eli, he was listening with his whole heart, the way a man does when he truly cares. Hannah stood guard at the window, her face set hard, ready for whatever was coming down that road. Clara's hands knew this work. Flour, water, salt. She could always make something from nearly nothing. It was 12 days till they had to be at the courthouse. 12 days for that crooked Judge Hargrove to make his play. 12 days till she found out if she'd lose everything she had. She slid the biscuits in the oven, the heat warm on her face, and got back to work. The courthouse felt cold as a tomb. Clara felt the chill creep right through her boots and the black wool dress she hadn't worn since her husband Jim's funeral. It smelled of cedar and sorrow. She stood on the bottom step, her breath making white clouds in the December air, and waited. The whole mess started when the territorial court sent a freeze order, stopping all tax business in the county. Judge Hargrove, he just plain ignored it. He nailed a notice to the courthouse door. Auction was happening as planned, 9 in the morning sharp. He was calling everyone's bluff. Clara's lawyer, Fletcher, had ridden hard from Denver, showing up the night before with official copies of the order. He looked worn to the bone. "He's just trying to scare you," Fletcher had said. "If he sells that land, the sale ain't worth the paper it's written on." Clara knew better. "He don't care about the law," she told him. "He just cares about breaking people." Now, standing beside her, Eli looked like a man from a different world. He wore a fine, dark wool suit with a gold watch chain glinting on his vest. He wasn't her Eli. He was Elijah Thornton Beckett, the rich cattleman from Montana. That suit felt like a wall between them, a reminder that he had choices she never would. "You ready?" he asked her, his voice low. Clara shook her head. "Me neither," he admitted. On her other side, Hannah stood tall, holding the little wooden horse Sam gave her for luck. The big courthouse doors creaked open, and Burl Kendrick, Hargrove's man, stepped out. His eyes found Clara and Eli in the crowd and stayed there, a sneer on his face. Fletcher walked right up the steps, a leather case in his hand. "I need to see Judge Hargrove," he said. Kendrick just stood there. "Judge is busy." Fletcher held up a sealed envelope. "This here is a certified order from the territorial court. If the judge holds this auction, he's in contempt." Kendrick stared at the envelope, then past Fletcher to where Eli stood. "Wait here," he grumbled and took the letter inside. A woman named Agnes moved closer to Clara. "We got 18 signatures," she whispered. "Everyone he's wronged is here today." Clara looked out and saw them. Folks who'd lost everything to Hargrove. They'd come back to fight. The doors opened again, and Judge Hargrove himself stepped out. He was a big man with a face full of sour whiskey. He held Fletcher's envelope in his hand, still sealed. "This auction," he boomed, his voice filling the square, "will proceed as scheduled." Fletcher stepped up. "Judge, you've been served with a legal freeze order." Hargrove just smiled. "I've received your paper, Mr. Fletcher." He set the unopened envelope on the rail beside him. "And I'll give it the consideration it deserves. This is a county matter. Your Denver court has no say here." The clerk, a man thin as a rail, unrolled a paper. "First parcel, the Mallister property." Clara's heart seized up. She gripped the little horse in her pocket till it hurt. "Do I hear an opening bid?" the clerk chirped. $50, Kendrick called from the top of the steps, bidding for the judge, same as always. Then another voice cut through the cold air, calm and strong. $150. Every head turned. It was Eli. He walked up the steps, slow and steady. "Elijah Thornton Beckett, of the Beckett Cattle Company," he announced. "I'm bidding for Mrs. Clara Mallister, the rightful owner." He looked right at Hargrove. $150 to clear all her debts, including the note held by your bank, Judge. The First National, where you just happened to hold a controlling interest." A hush fell over the crowd. The judge's face turned the color of buttermilk. He'd been beat, and everyone there saw it. Eli stepped forward and announced that for the past 2 years, Judge Hargrove had bought every foreclosed property in the county using shell companies tied to his family. The crowd started murmuring. Hargrove's face turned beet red as he yelled that he was just a bidder at a public auction. Eli ignored him and pulled out a thick stack of cash. He slowly counted out $150 and settled Mrs. Mallister's debt, which made the auction void. Hargrove insisted the auction was not void until he said so. But Eli was ready. He looked right at the judge and said, "I know you went to law school in St. Louis and finished third in your class." I checked. Hargrove was stunned into silence. Eli then pulled out more papers. "These are the tax assessments for every property around here. Your ranch was assessed at $1.25 an acre. But Mrs. Mallister's land was assessed at $4 an acre. Every property with a high assessment went to auction, and every auction was won by someone connected to you. The winning bids were then transferred to a company called the Western Progress Land Trust," Eli explained. He let that sink in before adding, "which is registered to your wife." The courthouse steps fell completely silent. Hargrove gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He called them baseless accusations. Eli corrected him, saying they were documented facts, filed with the territorial court. He then mentioned that the territorial marshal was in town having breakfast at the hotel, and was very eager to discuss the documents with the judge. The color drained from Hargrove's face. He looked around wildly and accused Eli of bluffing. Eli stepped closer and told him, "I do not bluff." He quietly gave Hargrove his only way out: walk away, void the auction, and resign. If he cooperated, the lawyers would not push for criminal charges. It was the best deal he was going to get. Hargrove stared. the full weight of his collapsing empire hitting him all at once. "You have no idea what you have done," Hargrove said, his voice shaking. Eli replied, "I know exactly what I have done. I chose my side, just like Mrs. Mallister did when she pointed that shotgun at me." Hargrove looked past Eli to Clara, standing there with her daughter and the crowd of people he had cheated. He promised this was not over, but Eli told him, "For you, it is." Hargrove turned and walked back inside the courthouse, defeated. The man with the rifle who had threatened Clara weeks ago just vanished into the crowd. The clerk, left all alone on the steps, announced that the auction was suspended. The crowd did not cheer so much as roar with relief. Friends grabbed Clara, some were crying, others threw their hats in the air. Clara felt like she might collapse. Eli came down the steps and stood before her. He looked tired, as if the whole showdown had taken a piece out of him. "It's done," Eli said. Clara could not find her voice. He had just stood up to a judge for her, for all of them. He nodded at the crowd Agnes had ridden 30 miles in the snow to gather. Hannah stepped forward. After a long stare, she offered Eli her hand. They shook once. "You still only get 2 biscuits," she told him. A real smile finally broke across Eli's face, like a man breathing free after years of holding on. "Yes, ma'am," he said. On the quiet ride home, Clara watched 2 sets of hoofprints trail behind them in the snow, where for 3 years there had been none. The silence between them on the ride home was different. It was the quiet of folks who had been through it all together. As they topped the hill, the cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney. Before they even reached the gate Eli had fixed, Sam burst out the door. "Mama, Ellie ate 3 biscuits." Clara slid off her horse and scooped him up. "3 whole biscuits?" she laughed. Inside, Ellie sat in bed, color back in her cheeks. She threw her arms open for her mother, and Clara held her close, feeling the simple living warmth of her child. Hannah was already at the stove, working with the supplies Eli had brought. The hard line of her jaw was finally gone. Eli stood in the doorway, waiting. Clara looked at him over her daughter's head. "You are letting the cold in," she said. He stepped inside and shut the door. That night, they all sat at the table. Hannah had set out 5 plates without a word. After supper, Eli went out to the porch. Clara tucked the children in and followed him. She sat in the second chair, the one he had mended, under a sky packed with stars. "Fletcher says this could take 6 months," Eli said. "Might get ugly." "I have got friends now, it seems," Clara replied. They rocked in a comfortable rhythm. "Come spring," Eli went on, "I am thinking of bringing up 30 head from Denver." They talked plans, about grass and a proper barn. It felt real this time. "That watch," Clara said after a moment. "The words on it. Build something worth keeping," he said, pulling it from his shirt. "My father's words. He meant cattle, the business." "What do you think he meant?" Eli closed the watch. "Whatever you are most scared to lose." Clara used to be afraid of just losing this land. But now, looking at Eli, she knew it was more. "I guess I have got more worth keeping," she said. His hand found hers in the dark, his palm rough and warm. From inside, Sam's sleepy voice called, "Mama, can I name the horse Eli?" Clara smiled at Eli, who had that soft look he got around her children. "You name it whatever you want, sweet boy." Eli's hand tightened on hers. "I am not going anywhere," he said, his voice low. "I know." He squeezed her hand gently. "This is where I want to be." Clara looked out at their land, covered in clean new snow. "Then stay," she said. On the porch, 2 chairs rocked together. 2 people held hands in the cold, and inside 3 children slept safe in a home that would stay theirs. Tomorrow would bring work, a case to fight, and a future to build from nothing but stubborn hope. But tonight, there was just this: 2 chairs, 2 hands, and stars so thick they looked like spilled flour across a dark table. For the first time in 3 years, Clara took a breath that did not hurt. There is something about a story like this that lingers. Not because it ends perfectly, but because you recognized a piece of yourself. Maybe you were Clara, splitting bread you could not spare. Maybe you were Eli, hiding behind walls because trust felt impossible. Or maybe you were Sam, holding a hammer and a wooden horse just waiting for someone to stay. We have all wondered if kindness still means something, or if we have been foolish to believe in it. This story does not answer that. It just sits with you, the way Clara and Eli sat together, not needing answers, just needing someone beside them. Thank you for listening. And if you have ever given your last piece of bread to a stranger, or been that stranger who needed it, I hope you know that it mattered. It always matters. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.